Y24 News Defense Magazine, I'm Alon Ben David with your weekly review of security, intelligence and strategic affairs. In this edition, we go to the International Institute for Counter-Terrorism conference at the IDC in Herzliya and speak to some of the world's leading experts on terror. We examine the claims that the Islamic State is taking advantage of the refugee crisis in order to infiltrate Europe. And finally, we take a look at an international Air Force drill hosted by the US Air Force known as the Red Flag. Let's begin. The International Institute for Counter-Terrorism 5th Annual Conference, the World Summit on Counter-Terrorism, gathered the world's leading experts on terrorism and focused on the challenges currently faced by the international community to fight against this phenomena. Tom Ridge, first U.S. Secretary for Homeland Security and former Governor of Pennsylvania, join us now from the conference. Mr. Ridge, thank you for joining us.
Well, thank you very much. It's a pleasure to join you as well.
How would you define the main threat today in terrorism-wise on the U.S.?
Well, one of the challenges I think that the world community has, U.S. has, et cetera, are two forms of terrorism. There's physical terrorism. It's the proxies of Iran, Hezbollah, Hamas, their operation in Yemen. There's Boko Haram, there's Al-Qaeda, there's ISIL, and the tentacles of some of these larger organizations are growing across the globe. That's one of the reasons I'm here, one, to participate in the ICT conference, and the other reason I'm here is that we begun a company called Ridge Global Capital Group, and the challenge of cybersecurity requires us to take a look at innovative technology, and there's a lot of innovative cyber technology addressed and available here in Israel. So that it's interesting your question aligns to the two reasons that I'm visiting.
Do you fear that radical ideologies could infect the American Muslim community?
Well, I think we should fear no enemy. We just have to respect who they are and the horror and evil that they bring to our individual countries and as they expand across the globe to other countries. And while we shouldn't be breathless about it, we ought to be mindful of the fact that this is a scourge, it's global, and it's going to be with us for quite some time until, again, I keep talking about the broader global community accepts the reality that Islamic fundamentalism is at the heart of the challenges associated with both physical and cybersecurity. Make no mistake about it. One of the reasons I opposed the Iranian nuclear deal is part of that signing bonus that they're going to get for signing that deal. We should make no mistake about it. They will build up their cyber infrastructure. So I think you accept the reality that the scourge of global terrorism and the global internet, which can be used by terrorists, is upon us, and we have to look for innovative technologies like those they have in developing here in Israel. The strategic operation, military and intelligence communities collaborating together to deal with both.
And how effective is the U.S. today in preventing Islamist extremism from entering the country?
You know, it's a difficult question to give you a very specific answer. I frankly think that our approach toward dealing with Islamic fundamentalism has waned, if you can even and call it an approach. I mean, I think one of the challenges the United States has, and all those in my country, at least many of us, pause and don't understand why our leader, our president, doesn't recognize the basis of the terrorism for what it is. It is this radical Islamic fundamentalism, and one of the most basic, one of the most fundamental needs when you're combating an enemy is to be able to know and understand the enemy and its origin. And I think, as you well know, I was the first Secretary of Homeland Security, but I happen to think that we misnamed our effort to defeat the terrorists. We said it's a war on terror. Well, terrorism is a tactic. We're not war against a tactic. We are war against a belief system, a zealotry that embraces religion to justify the killing of innocents. And so until we get a president who, very much like President Bush, understood the nature of the enemy, I think our efforts will not be as focused and as successful as they should be.
And finally, as you mentioned, you've been a vocal opponent of the nuclear deal with Iran. Now that it appears to be done, what are the risks that you see?
Well, to the vocal opponents, and there's obviously here in Israel, there's many in the United States. Ironically, in the United States, the recent poll said the majority of Americans oppose the deal, majority of the members of the House of Representatives and the Senate oppose the deal. I think what we say to those, and because of our Constitution, the President's veto of the resolution in opposition of the arrangement will be sustained. We don't have enough votes to override the veto, and both in Israel and the United States, we respect the rule of law, but it does change the environment. And again, one of the cruel, I think, incredible ironies is that we're going to let the Iranians rebuild their energy structure, open the markets to them, give them access to billions and billions of dollars, and yet they're the greatest risk and the greatest source of instability in the Middle East. So what I think that says to those of us who oppose the deal, all right, what's our new strategic and operational alignment with the only democracy in the Middle East, with the people and the government of Israel? And I think accepting the reality, and we don't have to like it, but we do have to accept it, requires us to fundamentally rethink where are the areas we continue to collaborate, where do we build upon, where do we call on the United States and Israel to work more specifically and more aggressively together to deal with the rising threat. And no mistake about it, one of the reasons I oppose it is when you put that many resources in the hands of someone that is called death to America, death to Israel, we don't think we can do anything but conclude you're going to increase the risk. So if we're going to increase the risk by supporting this regime, then we obviously have to try to reduce the risk by changing the nature of our support to our friends, particularly the government and the people of Israel.
Governor Ridge, thank you very much for this interview. The Islamic State, responsible for countless terror attacks in the Middle East and around the world, is arguably the most prominent threat to the world today. In light of the growing refugee crisis in Europe, many fear that the extreme Islamist movement may be taking advantage of the influx in order to pose as migrants from the Middle East and infiltrate European countries. Here's more.
It's possibly Europe's worst fear. Islamic State terrorists sneaking into the continent undetected amongst the tide of refugees desperately seeking asylum. And it may not be groundless. The IS itself boasted that between 4,000 to 5,000 extremists have already made it to the continent disguised as migrants. This could be propaganda. The propaganda of terror is an Islamic State specialty. But can anyone afford to take the chance? For some, the threat only confirms what they've been saying all along, and the numbers don't matter.
When ISIS say they will use the migrant tide to flood Europe with 500,000 of their own jihadists, I think we better listen. 500,000 may not be realistic, but what if it's 5,000? What if it's 500?
It's not as if Europe had been terrorist-free until now. The problem of extremists who are radicalized at home and decide to wage jihad among their home communities is, sadly, something Europe needs to get used to. As is the threat already realized of extremists leaving to join the Islamic State and then returning home. The European Union says that while the Islamic State is involved in human trafficking of illegal migrants, there is no evidence that they themselves will use this to infiltrate, and homegrown extremists are the main issue.
I'm not aware they themselves use the network to infiltrate. The main threat comes from foreign terrorist fighters, and these are Europeans with a citizenship of a member state. So they don't need to use a network of illegal migrants because they can use a valid passport.
But so far, the attacks carried out by homegrown terrorists, tragic and infuriating as they may be, are relatively isolated. It's a lot easier for Europe's security services to keep track of their homegrown extremists, or to track those who left to join the IS and then came home. Monitoring thousands of new jihadist arrivals is another matter, especially when you have no idea who they are or where they are headed. But what's the alternative? It's impossible to fully screen all migrants, And keeping them all out, as tempting as that might be for some countries, is also not an option. In the final analysis, it doesn't really matter how many jihadists infiltrate into Europe. All it takes is just one attack, and Europe's migrant problems will take on a whole new dimension.
Now, returning to the conference to analyze this issue, we are joined by Baroness Pauline Neville-Jones, former Minister of State for Security and Counter-Terrorism and a member of the UK National Security Council. Madam, thank you very much for joining us.
Thank you. Pleasure to be here.
How do you view the way Europe is handling the current refugee crisis?
Well, you know, you've got different national approaches, and I think the Germans are in the lead on trying to deal in a humane and civilized way with the influx of refugees in continental Europe. My own country, the UK, has a slightly different approach. We don't belong to the Schengen Agreement, and though we are going to take refugees, we will take them directly from the camps. We think that discouraging the flow of people by demonstrating that, you know, you can secure asylum and refugee status directly from the camps is a way of helping staunch the flow of people who are otherwise just traveling. And secondly, we want to be able to select people on the basis of need and with an eye to our own security and remain in control. I think the chief problem at the moment in Europe is the lack of control which the governments have over this surge of people coming across the borders. And it's difficult to stop in the short term, but it clearly can't just continue.
So you see a threat that those migrants would include potential terrorists?
Well, it's always possible, is it not? I mean, I think that's fairly clear that a terrorist organization would have an interest in trying to infiltrate people into a country, and I think that the governments of the countries who receive these people will do well to screen them. It's in the security of the countries themselves, but also in the interests of the refugees that they take in. That those refugees, you know, have a good reputation in the country and don't appear to be a source of danger to the inhabitants. So I think if they're wise, there will be a security element.
We've seen reports here about very radical preaching taking place in some of the mosques in the UK. Do you think that the security agency in Britain have sufficient tools to monitor the spread of radical ideologies? The
problem of radical preaching in the UK, and I don't think the UK is unique in this, but it certainly has been a problem in the UK, that we have had a rather laissez-faire attitude until relatively recently to allowing people in and to freedom of speech. Also, this preaching often takes place in languages which most of us in the UK don't understand. So they've been quite a hard target, but we're now well aware of it. It's very important in those contexts that the police, on whom we really depend for information as an organized country, themselves had good contacts and have the confidence of the local community, because ultimately it is going to be Muslims themselves who are going to decide that this is not an influence that they wish to see in the community. So a combination of good policing, of good community relations, and of legislation which outlaws preaching violence. And we do. It's illegal to do that in the UK. You cannot now preach violence. You will be prosecuted. So you have to have a variety of methods to get at this. How are we bringing it under control? To a much greater extent than was previously the case, but we are aware that there are mosques with traditions which are quite extreme.
And finally, what do you think would be the impact of the flow of migrants from the Middle East on the future face of the European continent?
I would expect it to result in some changes and probably some reduction in the rights of non-EU citizens. The delicate area, I think, is going to be the question of whether there's also a further reduction or a reduction now in some of the practices that pertain to EU citizens, one of the main issues being, is it right and proper for EU citizens to go in search of work in other countries without any let or hindrance, or should it be on the basis that they have a job to go to? That gets into quite deep issues, and of course is also tied up part and parcel with the economic difficulties that Europe now confronts. This is not an easy moment for the European Union, but I do have faith that, given some time and some good judgment, and I think it will be forthcoming, these problems will be resolved.
Baroness Neville-Jones, thank you very much for joining us.
Thank you.
And that's all we have time for. Be sure to visit us again next week for another edition of I-24 News Defense. Today we leave you with impressive images from the Red Flag Air Force exercise at Nellis Air Force Base in Nevada. Hosted by the US Air Force, this is the first time in 6 years Israel has participated in the exercise, along with Jordan and Singapore. Have a safe night from the Jaffa Port, and to those of you celebrating the new Jewish year, Shana Tova.